When did you decide that you would worship at St. John's today? When was that decision made? It's likely that someone made that decision only this morning. There are others who probably decided earlier this past week. You may have decided years ago that Sunday morning worship at St. John's would just be included in your weekly schedule. That means that last June, you could legitimately have said, barring unforeseeable circumstances, I will be in worship at St. John's on February 14, 2016. When did you decide that you would worship at St. John's today? At some point in the past, no person present here today had any plan whatsoever to be at St. John's today. And yet, every single one of us is here. You ever ask yourself whose plan that was? In the course of our lives, we all end up in some places we never could have planned to go. If we could somehow see all the paths that brought us all here together today, we would at least see this thing clearly. We would see that the human way is not a straight path to predetermined destinations. We would see that the human way is a wandering way. The human way is a wandering way with meaning. It's a wandering way with meaning that often reveals itself best when we're looking back. So, what can be seen on the path that brought you here today? Hundreds upon hundreds, maybe even thousands of little twists and turns that hardly seem significant at all. Maybe a few off-ramps to entirely different roads and destinations. Did any of the little twists and turns on your wandering journey play any role at all in bringing you here this morning? Can you identify particular off-ramps that put you on completely different roads that eventually brought you here to St. John's today? Which turns are the ones that made you who you are now? The human way is a wandering way with meaning that reveals itself best when we're looking back. This was true also for Jesus, who traveled the wandering human way just as we do. You do realize, don't you, that Jesus had around 30 years of life under his belt before most of what we know about him ever even happened. History barely left any record at all of the first 90% of his life. And he was doing something then. I wonder why. Well, piecing things together, we do know some things. We know he grew up in a tiny, poor community called Nazareth. Wonder what it was like to grow up in Nazareth. We know he had brothers and sisters. We know that his dad, Joseph, was a carpenter by trade. And Joseph is hardly mentioned after Jesus' birth, so many think that he may have died when Jesus was just a little boy. I wonder how that affected Jesus. Mary, his mother, may have been a very young widow, raising several kids. There are indications that Jesus was something of a prodigy. Some indications are that he may have even been a little bit of a brat, and a smart one. Jesus' uncle, Zechariah, was a priest. And Zechariah and Jesus' aunt Elizabeth were the parents of his cousin who came to be known as John the Baptizer. And yes, it's John the Baptizer, not John the Baptist. But John the Baptizer was a rather odd fellow who became a central figure and a preacher in a kind of a first century end times movement that Jesus participated in to some degree. In fact, history's record of Jesus really begins with 30-year-old Jesus submitting to John's baptism. Wouldn't you love to be able to see all the twists and turns and off-ramps in the 30 years of life that led up to Jesus' baptism by John? We don't always think of him this way. But Jesus, just like us, traveled the wandering way of human life with meaning that reveals itself best by looking back, which brings us to the story about Jesus' wilderness face-off with the devil. Because this is a looking back story. It's a looking back story that Jesus must have told himself at some point. I mean, after all, how else would we even know about it? No one else was with Jesus in this secluded wilderness experience where he struggled mightily with the very same powerful and contradictory human passions that present themselves to all of us who would take up God's cause. And you have to wonder when Jesus first told this story. And was he with disciples like us? In a moment when they were doubting themselves and overwhelmed by their own struggles and wondering if Jesus ever had any at all? Well, he certainly did have struggles. Jesus struggled mightily. But look what he learned coming out of that struggle. Jesus learned in a mighty struggle in the wilderness that the one who chooses sacrifice, chooses it for the good, that person is freed from manipulation, either by the promise of having it all, being manipulated by that enticement or that promise, or being manipulated by the threat of losing even a little bit. Jesus learned that the one who chooses sacrifice has power over those kinds of forces and is not easily manipulated. Jesus learned in a mighty struggle in the wilderness that the one who chooses humility for the sake of service is freed from manipulation either by the promise of popularity or by the threat to one's reputation. Jesus learned that the one who chooses humility has power over those kinds of forces and is not easily manipulated. Jesus learned in a mighty struggle in the wilderness that the one who chooses trust in respect of others is freed from manipulation either by the promise of control or power or by the threat to one's security. Jesus learned in a mighty struggle in the wilderness that the human way is no straight path to predetermined destinations. The human way is a wandering way. But how empowering to learn from Jesus that our wandering human way is also the way that leads to the kingdom of God. And there's another happy destination that none of us could ever have planned. In the name of God, amen.